In the year 1913, something happened in America that seemed small and harmless at the time. Nobody imagined it would reshape the entire country's financial future. It was not a dramatic event like a war or a stock market crash. It was not a revolution with battles and protests. What changed America in 1913 was something much quieter, a new tax. This one decision would eventually become one of the largest wealth shifts in modern history. To understand what happened in 1913, we need to look at America before this year. In 1913, America was booming with success. Factories were being built everywhere. Railroads were expanding across the entire country. The economy was growing fast and strong, but this growth benefited some people much more than others. A small group of men controlled most of the wealth. These men had names that are still famous today: Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. These industrial giants owned huge companies and controlled enormous amounts of money. They owned factories, railroads, oil companies, and banks. Their power over the American economy was almost total. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were struggling. Farmers had little money. Workers in factories earned very small wages. The gap between the rich and the poor was growing bigger every year. People could see that a few very wealthy men lived in luxury while millions of ordinary Americans worked hard but remained poor. The government at that time got its money in a different way than we think of today. The federal government mainly relied on tariffs, which are taxes on goods brought into the country from other nations. If you wanted to buy something made in Europe or Asia, you had to pay extra money in tariffs. This made everything more expensive for regular people. Farmers hated tariffs because they made it cost more to buy tools and equipment. Workers hated tariffs because they made food and clothing more expensive. Everyone except the wealthy wanted something to change. Politicians heard the complaints from the people. They knew something had to be different, but what could they do? Then came an important change in the law, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment allowed the federal government to tax people as personal income directly for the first time during peacetime. Before this, the government was not allowed to do this. Now, it could. When the federal income tax was first introduced in 1913, it seemed like a reasonable solution to everyone's problems. The government said this tax would be small and would only hit the people who could afford to pay it. Only the top 3% of Americans would have to pay this new tax. The maximum rate was just 7%. 7% seems small to us today, but it was important at the time. Newspapers printed articles saying the tax was fair and necessary. Politicians made speeches explaining that only the very wealthy would pay. Teachers and small business owners would not be affected. Farm families would not be affected. Regular workers would not be affected. Everyone seemed to accept this new tax because it seemed to target only people who had far too much money anyway. But there was a question that nobody really asked at the time. What happens when a government gets a permanent claim on private capital? What happens when government officials can reach into the money that private citizens have worked to earn? Nobody thought about this question in 1913. That was a mistake. Let us think about how money moved through America before 1913. Imagine capital as water flowing through a series of pipes. Before 1913, these pipes were entirely private. Entrepreneurs would earn money and decide where to invest it. They would build factories or invest in railroads. Rich investors would take their money and decide which companies to support. Banks would take money from depositors and decide which businesses to lend to. Capital flowed from person to person, from company to company. The flow was private and individual. Then in 1913, something changed. A valve was installed in the pipes. This valve was in Washington, controlled by the federal government. Now, when capital tried to flow through the system, some of it would be diverted. The government would open the valve and take a small portion of the flow for itself. At first, the valve barely opened, just 7% came out. The pipe was still mostly private, but the government now had a new power. It could adjust that valve whenever it wanted. For a few years, the valve stayed mostly closed. The tax rate remained around 7%. Then World War I started in Europe. America eventually joined the war in 1917. Suddenly, the government needed much more money. It needed money for weapons, soldiers, uniforms, ships, and everything else required for war. Taxes went up very quickly. Within just a few years, the highest tax rate jumped from 7% to over 70%. 70%. This meant that wealthy people kept only 30 cents from every last dollar they earned. What happened was that the temporary emergency measure became permanent. The government said that once the war ended, tax rates would come back down, but they did not come back down very much. Each new crisis, a recession, a depression, another war gave the government a reason to raise taxes even higher. The emergency that was supposed to be temporary became the normal way of doing things. The valve stayed mostly open. Something important happened when taxes became so high. The behavior of wealthy people changed. When you can only keep 30 cents from every dollar you earn, you start making different choices about your money. You do not invest the same way. You do not spend the same way. You do not build the same way. Wealthy people and large corporations began changing their strategies. Instead of keeping profits to reinvest in their companies, corporations paid out more money to shareholders. Instead of putting money in banks, wealthy people looked for other places to put their capital that would avoid taxes. Tax shelters were created. Offshore strategies grew. Trusts were set up to protect family wealth. Rich people had to think creatively about keeping the money they earned. The balance of power in America shifted. Before 1913, private individuals and corporations controlled most of the money and most of the economic decisions. After the tax increases, the federal government controlled a much larger portion of the nation's income. This was a fundamental change in how America worked. But most people did not understand what was happening. They did not see the long-term consequences. When you permanently redirect a portion of national income year after year, decade after decade, you do not just fund government programs. You reshape the entire ownership structure of wealth in the country. You change who owns what. You change who controls capital. You change who has power. By the 1940s, the highest tax rates had climbed above 90%. 90%. This is hard for us to imagine today. Imagine building a business from nothing. Imagine working harder than anyone else, taking risks, making smart decisions, and building a successful company. Then imagine the government telling you that of every last dollar your company earns, you get to keep less than 10 cents. The rest belongs to the government. This was the reality for America's highest earners during the 1940s. This extreme situation led to the first major consequence. Government size grew dramatically. The federal government hired more workers. It built more offices. It created more programs. It started providing services that private companies had provided before. Federal spending grew larger and larger every year. The government became involved in more parts of American life than ever before. The second major consequence was that the tax began to affect middle-class people. What started as a tax on the top 3% slowly spread to include more and more people. Inflation made wages grow. People earned more money. But the tax brackets did not adjust for inflation at first. Suddenly, teachers, doctors, and small business owners found themselves paying the income tax. The tax that was supposed to hit only the ultra-wealthy was now hitting ordinary middle-class workers. These workers had to pay money they needed for their families' living expenses. The third consequence was that capital markets changed. Investors had to find new ways to save money that would not be taxed as heavily. This is why retirement accounts were invented. A worker could put money into a retirement account and not pay taxes on it immediately. Corporations changed how they financed themselves. Instead of using their own profits to expand, they borrowed money from banks. This worked because interest payments could be deducted from taxes. Money flowed differently through the economy. It was no longer flowing naturally. It was flowing in the direction that the tax code pushed it. Even modern American housing was influenced by these tax policies. The government decided to let homeowners deduct mortgage interest from their taxes. This made borrowing money to buy a house cheaper. So more people bought houses, prices went up, demand for construction increased. The entire housing industry was shaped by tax policy. Money flowed toward housing because the tax code encouraged it. The flow of capital was now being engineered by government policy. Looking back at more than a century of history, we can see a clear pattern. Emergency policies rarely disappear. They expand, they become normal, they continue year after year. The 1913 income tax began as something modest and targeted at only the wealthy. Over time, it became the backbone of how the federal government pays for everything it does. Today, the federal income tax is simply how America works. Most people cannot imagine a country without income tax. This pattern has continued into modern times. Today, people debate whether the capital gains tax should be higher or lower. They debate whether there should be a wealth tax on billionaires. They debate how much the government should spend and whether it should borrow money to pay for things. These debates echo the same questions that were asked in 1913. Who controls capital? Who should bear the burden of paying for government? How permanent are temporary measures? Are the policies that governments create truly temporary, or do they last forever? The most important lesson from this history is that financial structures last much longer than political promises. Once government gains access to a new source of revenue, it rarely gives it up. Once politicians discover they can use tax policy to encourage certain behaviors and discourage others, they keep using this power. Once people adjust their lives to new tax rules, changing those rules creates disruption. What was the actual result of all these changes? Money moved, wealth redistributed, the ownership of assets changed. Before 1913, most capital was controlled by private wealthy individuals and the corporations they owned. By the end of the 20th century, much more capital was controlled by the federal government, by pension funds, by mutual funds, and by ordinary people saving for retirement. The structure of wealth ownership had transformed. This transformation was not all bad or all good. It had both positive and negative effects. Some would argue that lower taxes encouraged more investment and more economic growth. Others would argue that government spending funded important programs like Social Security and Medicare that helped people. The truth is that these taxes and the government spending they funded had complex effects on the entire economy and on American society. What we can say with certainty is that nothing that happened was what people expected in 1913. The small 7% tax on the top 3% of earners did not stay small. It grew continuously. It expanded to include more and more people. It changed the behavior of investors, businesses, and workers. It shifted how capital moved through the economy. It changed the relationship between private citizens and their government. Today, in 2026, we might ask ourselves, are we living through another structural shift in how wealth flows? Are there new policies being introduced that seem small and temporary but might have enormous long-term consequences? History suggests that we should pay attention to policies that seem harmless at first. History suggests that what seems temporary often becomes permanent. History suggests that once government gains a new power, it tends to keep that power and expand it. The income tax introduced in 1913 teaches us to think carefully about financial policies. It teaches us to ask what the long-term consequences might be, not just what the immediate effects are. It teaches us that policies meant for one purpose often get used for different purposes. It teaches us that even small changes can have enormous effects over decades. The people who introduced the income tax in 1913 probably believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were being fair. They believed they were solving problems. They probably did not think about what would happen 100 years later. They probably did not imagine tax rates would reach 90%. They probably did not imagine the income tax would become the main way the federal government pays for everything. They probably did not understand that they were starting a process that would reshape the entire structure of American wealth and power. A tax introduced in 1913 quietly transformed the architecture of American finance. It shifted capital flows, it shifted power, it shifted wealth. It changed how fortunes could be built. It changed how governments could spend money. It changed the relationship between private citizens and their government. Over 100 years, this single decision had enormous consequences for millions of people. Today, we live in a world shaped by decisions made in 1913. The tax code guides where money flows. Government spending influences which industries grow and which decline. The structure of wealth in America looks completely different from what it looked like before 1913, and most people do not even realize how much their lives have been shaped by that one decision made more than a century ago. The real question is not what happened in 1913. The question is what happens next. Are we making new decisions today that will reshape America as future the way the income tax reshaped the past? Are emergency measures being introduced today that will become permanent tomorrow? Will people 100 years from now look back at 2026 the way we look back at 1913, wondering how one small policy decision had such enormous consequences? History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. The patterns of the past can teach us about the future. If we understand how the income tax grew from a small emergency measure into the foundation of American government finance, we might better understand how other policies might grow and change over time. We might ask better questions about whether policies are truly temporary. We might think more carefully about the long-term consequences of decisions that seem harmless in the moment. That is perhaps the most important lesson from the emergency tax of 1913.